You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your barely conscious host, Abraham.
And I'm your calculating a lot of data really rapidly host, Shane.
Nice. Good job. We're a psychology podcast, and we talk about all the things that people do, and sometimes the things that people make, and then the things that they make do. That's what we're talking about today. And we're so lucky we get to have someone who's much more of an expert in this than we are, and that allowed me to not have to read as much as I normally have to read when I'm putting things together. And I like reading, but it does take a lot of time. So thanks for being here. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Joseph Dailey. Joey, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, folks. My name is Joey. I'm an electrical engineering student at University of Nevada, Reno. I'm a graduate student studying how we might be able to use reinforcement learning to make robots more pleasant to work with, safer, smarter, better at doing what people want them to do. I am also a teacher and musician, and I'm very fortunate to be a colleague of Abraham in the past, and very pleased to be here.
Yeah. Part of the reason that I felt like it made a lot of sense to have you come on to talk about this with us is because you have had your sort of feet in both ponds, if you will. I think you are someone who understands behavioral philosophy really well and also understands AI at least a lot better than anyone else that I know. And so being able to blend those two in a way that allows us to have a cogent conversation is really valuable.
Yeah, I have the rare distinction of being a slightly better than layperson in two fields. So, if that's sufficient, I'm happy to illuminate whatever I can here for you.
You're aggressively humble.
What do they say? An inch deep and a mile wide. Like you know just enough about a lot of things. It's like enough to have really cool conversations, but not enough to get on Jeopardy, which is perfectly fine. That's our demographic.
Might be a mile wide, but my experience of conversations with you is definitely more than an inch deep. This metaphor is getting awfully euphemistic. Let's go ahead and transition to our topic here. And actually, before we do that, just to remind everybody, if you'd like to support us, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, leave us a rating and review, subscribe, send us nice letters through large language model AI generation machines. We appreciate that too. And I'll talk more about this at the end of the discussion. But first, we should also recognize that if you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, we'd like to wish you a happy National Hot Buttered Rum Day. All right.
Okay.
I'll go through a couple more. It's also National Bootleggers Day. I'm not sure that's a profession a lot of people still carry.
It's also it's Museum Selfie Day. So if you like paintings, that's a really cool thing to go do. It's also Benjamin Franklin Day if you are a fan of kites, keys, electricity, and STDs.
Sure.
You can bootleg a bottle of hot buttered rum into a museum in Philadelphia.
Man, I mean, you are really celebrating with aplomb. There are more holidays, but we'll leave it for now. I think we've got such an interesting discussion I'm excited to get to. All right. Anything else before we jump into this conversation, Shane, that you can think of?
No, I'm really excited about this. The first conference talk that I ever did was on a paper that was about AI and behavior analysis. So I'm really excited to dive into this.
Oh, man. If you remind me, we should put a link to that in this.
No. We don't need to do that. I was way out of my scope, and I did a 50-minute talk in 30 minutes because I was too nervous. So I'm so excited to talk about this, though. I love this stuff.
I'm glad you said that, because one of the things that I think that may or may not come as a surprise to some people, depending on where they're at in the news with the world, I guess, is how much longer AI has been around than maybe it seems like, because the explosion of art generating AI and large language model AI in just the last couple of years has made it seem like we haven't had AI before this. We have, but it has definitely shifted dramatically. And I would say that I think the word of the year for 2023 was ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely heard that more than just about. I thought it was going to be spy balloons for a minute, but that pretty much petered out around like maybe March or April.
Yeah.
And then it was ChatGPT reigned supreme. So let's quickly discuss what AI is, and then we'll talk about some of the most popular applications of it now.
If we come to a consensus on what AI is, we will be doing We will be doing better than the field has been today.
We'll be doing God's work here.
Groundbreaking on this podcast. Yeah. Groundbreaking science.
Probably a good place to start is Ada Lovelace.
Okay.
Because I guess the earliest notion that we have of an artificial intelligence is just automation, right? The ability to instruct a machine to do something and have it do it. It's not a very robust form of intelligence, but with Ada Lovelace in I want to say the mid 19th century, we kind of have the first notion that we can make machines do sophisticated tasks, even tasks where some emergent behavior at the time of their execution might be necessary. I think Charles Babbage, who was a contemporary of Ada Lovelace and whose work she is credited with improving on, Charles Babbage was of the opinion that a machine with a few arithmetic operations could do everything of consequence to a human being.
Wow.
And then in the early 20th century, we started probing the limitations of systems like that. This is where we get the first work that essentially shows you can't do everything, at least not quickly or well, with conventional simple computers.
Fair. Yeah. Especially back then.
Especially back then, but it's even more extensive than that. I mean, this was some of the foundational work of, if you're familiar with these names, Church and Turing, and some of their contemporaries in early computer science, that there are really fundamental limitations to what can be accomplished with what's called, for example, a Turing machine, which is a general model of a computer.
Sure.
So that takes us into the middle of the 20th century, and people start looking at okay, well then we know that there are things people can do that we haven't succeeded in implementing very robustly with computers, which are supposed to be, in some ways at least, a lot faster and a lot smarter. So how do we bridge that gap? And people start looking then at neurology and figuring that there might be something structural in the way that brains are hooked up that enables some unexpected emergent behavior. And they're right. They're just not right for the right reasons yet. But so in the 1960s, we got what's called a perceptron. And you should Google a picture of this thing if you get a chance, one of the early perceptrons. They're really funky. The notion here is that if you can define your problem as a set of numeric inputs, it's like, say your problem is a picture that you want to classify as either being of a dog or not of a dog, 0 or 1, right? There's some linear combination of the pixels that comprise that image such that you can scale them somehow, add them up, maybe do that a few times in multiple layers, and eventually get out a number that's a 0 or a 1. And I say you should look this up because there wasn't a good way to implement this in silicon, or I guess at the time in tubes yet. So one of the first implementations of a perceptron was a machine with every individual linear weight in the model, quote unquote, was a physical knob that would be turned with a motor, and the motor would be whirring it back and forth as it progressed through the learning process until it honed in on exactly the right position for each dial.
Wow.
It's bizarre. Yeah, I think it's about the coolest thing ever built. And then that too quickly shows its faults.
The picture I'm looking at looks like a closet full of wires and knobs. This is the Mark I Perceptron machine. It looks like you open a closet door and it's just full of cables and wires and stuff. It's pretty extensive. Yeah. And for perspective, this might be as much as a millimeter on a modern silicon die,
right,
to implement something similar. We have come that far, because we're still talking about a computer is either a human job description or a room in a building at this time.
Right. Yeah. I know they've said that the computing power that it took to send people to the moon, we carry 10 times that in our pocket on our phone.
Yeah. So we're talking about those heady days of early electronic computing. So yeah, they start doing this. They find that perceptrons can classify images really well, can handle certain kinds of data really well. People get excited that, hey, maybe this is artificial intelligence. This is not just rote algorithmic behavior. This is something legitimately novel. And so they start trying to apply it to machine translation, and that falls through pretty quick.
Sure. Were they like asking it how it feels?
we're not even there yet. We're at the point where people are trying to like apply inside of like DARPA, are starting to try and apply computers to the process of like translating English to French or whatever. And it's just not there is nothing that's much better than just simple word substitutions. And then at the same time, there's a proof that perceptrons cannot solve certain what we call nonlinear classification problems. Meaning if you were to plot all of the data that you want to classify into two groups, and let's say you have group 1, which is red, and group 2, which is blue, unless you can separate red and blue with a single clean stroke on the graph, or, if there are more than two variables, then a plane, a hyperplane, but unless you can put a clean linear boundary between your two groups, a perceptron can't do it. And that leads us into what we call the AI winter.
Ooh, that sounds so scary.
It sort of was. It was beginning to look for computer scientists like a very dark and lonely time, because confidence in the ability of machines to ever replicate some of the things people can do had just evaporated, and the funding went with it. This was, you'll get different dates on this, but from roughly I'd say the 1970s to the 90s, nobody is looking very much at neural networks. Nobody is looking very much at AI anymore. Obviously there are exceptions, but there's sort of a broad agreement that the potential is limited.
Do you think that's why disco took hold? Like, why there was this like gap in, human intelligence growing and developing, so they had to, supplant it with something like, I don't know, Donna Summers?
The intellectual pessimism of the day. They needed something better to do.
That explained how Reagan got elected too.
Yeah. And then we ended up with grunge, and we're like, okay, all right. Like it got real dark towards the end of this winter.
It gets better. This next part goes pretty fast. Starting in the 90s, 2000s, we start getting better, faster GPUs, graphical processing units. And these aren't just good for graphics, although people buy a lot of them for that. They're good at anything that requires a lot of very fast parallel computation that isn't super sophisticated. Like, I don't know, for example, like multiplying a lot of things by linear weights. So now all of a sudden we can do certain kinds of math that are applicable to AI really, really fast. People start taking renewed interest in recurrent neural networks, which are ones that feed back into themselves, and convolutional neural networks, which is like you have a little square window that slides over an image and looks at each little part of it and tries to identify what features of the image there are. And then in 2012, I think we get something called AlexNet, which is the first convolutional neural network that really excels at classifying images.
Cool.
We're talking like unprecedented performance in computer vision. And people start going, hey, wait, maybe there's something to this after all. And then in 2018, we get GPT, which is, I guess, kind of really why we're here talking about it.
Yeah.
GPT is for those of you who don't know, the OpenAI's generative pre-trained transformer. And what that means is generative, as it's making stuff. Right, it's not just performing a classification, or it's not performing a task. It is making stuff
on command. Yeah,
on command. Yeah, in response to a prompt, pre-trained, because this was never originally going to be a general purpose model. GPT was going to be sort of a basis for like, okay, we've trained it on a wide swath of the English language, pulled off the wild west of the internet, and then you can take this thing, this monstrosity, and kind of fine tune it a little bit with specific texts in your area of interest. And then a transformer there's a lot to what a transformer is, but the important thing there is that we're using a technology called self-attention, where the machine is looking both at the prompt and the text that it's generated, and it doesn't differentiate between the two. It just says, given this prior distribution of text, what's likely to come next?
Right.
Okay.
That's been difficult to do. Recurrent neural networks, like I said, with feedback, had been the way we were trying to do that for a long, long time. But there's this thing that happens where, because those process the text in order, you forget what comes at the beginning of the sentence before you reach the end, even if it's really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
And self-attention doesn't do that. Self-attention looks at the whole text all at once and identifies relationships between the words.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit more about why that might be relevant to how we think about language inside of psychology a little bit later, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm so sorry to do this to you, but unfortunately, we have to let the artificial unintelligence take over for just a moment, and that's our ads. Fortunately, our ad breaks for us are extremely short, so they're already over, but we'll go ahead and jump back into this. I wanted to comment that I think, as you said, what surprised me, and so I assume surprised other people about the use of ChatGPT, is how accurately it simulated generated language, because it spits out syntactically sensitive, relevant information immediately based on whatever prompt you give it. So much so that the first time I used it, I was like, is this like a joke? And there's someone on the other end of this. Is like a huge network group of people who there's someone on the other end generating responses to what I say, trying to make me believe that a computer is doing this, but it's actually gotten faster, like so much so that I'm like, oh, humans can't generate information that quickly.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. There was some speculation. I mean, it was even an in-joke for a while among people working on natural language processing, which is unfortunately not very much of what I do personally, but I was privy to some of these discussions where like people were joking that it was like Amazon Mechanical Turk, like you've hired somebody in another country on like a piecework basis to type back at you.
Yeah.
And that's why OpenAI has these billions of dollars in funding. But no, it's ridiculous how quick it's gotten. And syntax, the ability to generate really sophisticated prose, I think, is where it really shines. Of course, we'll talk too, I think, about where it maybe doesn't shine. But yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And for a long time, we thought that was sort of impossible because we just didn't have a compelling way to get there until we came up with this attention thing. And in fact, there's a paper. It's a little bit mathematically dense, but it's a good concept paper too if you're interested. It's called "Attention is All You Need," and it's sort of a discussion of why you don't need memory to generate really sophisticated, complex, accurate language on a computer. So, I mean, that's well worth reading if you want to. And by the way, this is not just news to you, and this is not just news to people using the technology. The efficiency with which transformers have scaled, the gains on performance that have been observed, were news to the people developing them.
Wow.
GPT-3 was already unexpectedly way better than GPT-2.
Yeah.
To the extent that this is where I think the public started taking a little bit more seriously the idea that AI could represent in and of itself, a major player in the fate of humanity over the next several decades, or this explosion in capability that nobody saw coming.
Well, and we're talking right now, nearly 200 years of research into this thing, right? Like at least like formal research and inquiry around this. I mean, you're talking from Ada Lovelace and like kind of like the conceptual stuff all the way till now. You've got 200 years of having this discussion, and all of a sudden it is like gone from we can do simple things to it is exploded into this really useful tool that people are still like kind of going, oh, what are the possibilities now? And even the people that have developed it have no idea what it can do.
Oh yeah. It's for the first time, we're not thinking about how do we get it to do what we want it to do. And there's a greater research effort directed at how do we know what it can do?
And then eventually it'll go, how can we stop this? I'm just kidding.
I mean, that's a real concern that people have. I mean, I think that maybe we underestimate the ability of really comparatively stupid models to impact human behavior pretty radically. I mean, the way that people have been persuaded to kind of, self-censor and use character substitutions on TikTok because they're afraid that the monetization algorithm will delete their videos and things like that. And so we have this interesting example where it's like, the purpose of the algorithm implemented on a platform like YouTube or TikTok is just to maximize engagement and profitability. But there's a sort of ancillary emergent goal happening in the aggregate as instances of these models cooperate that is a kind of like morality agent. Yeah. It's really fascinating that we don't need very sophisticated autonomous behavior at all for it to start really radically impacting people's lives. Coded Bias is a documentary that's out there that's a great examination of that. It happens all the time. And so, yeah, people are very, I think, maybe their picture of what that might look like is not always the most accurate, but I think people are very rightly concerned about how this affects humanity's, disposition in the world at large.
I work a lot in the publishing world, and there was some discussion around the issues of like AI generated books and that were written based on authors' writings. And so like there was like this use of this tool where these books were being written by ghostwriters essentially. And there is a discussion around kind of the art around that and the art being taken away. And so like, I guess going to your point, like people being rightly concerned about the uses of this tool and how there are really no limitations to it, or like what it can do and all that stuff. I think we're starting to see that stuff is going to kind of emerge, I imagine, over time, and then safeguards and stopgaps and stuff are going to have to be put in place as those problems start to arise, because we just don't know what those problems will be.
Mm-hmm. There is, as you had mentioned, the concern that grows about people. I think that there's on the more conspiratorial side, AI is going to take over everything and we're going to lose our jobs, and it's like it'll just want to kill people. And I think we need to get to that at some point. And then there's also, I think, the more practical side, which is that this is now shown to be useful enough that it actually can replace a chunk of human behavior in certain sectors of the workforce, and actually going after white collar jobs more so than blue collar jobs. And so those people who have a little bit more power and influence feeling particularly threatened and wanting to do something about it. And there's something to talk about in there. And I think also, we started with this trying to describe in some amount of definition what AI is. And if we look at the two words separately, and not to get too deep into the philosophy of this right at the moment, but artificial, I think the way we're using it right now is to suggest that it was created by human beings. And the intelligence part, I think we're aligning with some amount of generative autonomy in a sense, in the way that this is being applied. And whether you want to go back and parse out like, what intelligence actually is or isn't, or how we've tried to define it and failed for so long. And the idea that like, well, every time, a person only gains intelligence through interactions with education and teachers and learning. And if we've seen instances where they don't get that and they barely develop any kind of, cogent language or anything, or they can interact meaningfully with those around them. And so is that also then artificial because humans construct one another in the ways of intelligence? We don't need to go down that path. I think I would
really love to go down that path, but we can save that for later,
for the sequel.
If there's time, because there's a lot there. I mean, we are very attached as a species to the notion of intelligence as something special and intrinsic to us, maybe sometimes. And I think that's one place where the philosophy of behaviorism can be really helpful to us in understanding what this is. Do we necessarily have to privilege intelligence as an unobservable intrinsic quality in order to appreciate the capability of a sophisticated system? Just, there's that little thing to chew on. And I've been wrestling with that now for years.
Yeah.
I think more to the more immediate point, I mean, you're right. There are longitudinal concerns. Conspiratorial is one word, for sure. Your Eliezer Yudkowsky's in Time Magazine this past year talking about, an AI that with an insufficiently well-defined goal might inevitably find itself best served by doing something dangerous, existentially dangerous to people. And then we have the more immediate sense in which people's livelihoods are potentially endangered even now because, whether it's rightly placed or not, there is such speculative fervor over what human capabilities can be replaced with a technology like this. But before we get too excited about that, like I feel like that paints a pretty grim picture. I think it's also worth talking about things that these models are maybe not so good at.
Yeah. Part of this, where I was going, I think this segues nicely into this conversation, is the idea of like general intelligence, as we like to talk about among humans, versus specific intelligence, and what general intelligence would mean for AI, what specific intelligence means for AI. And also, like, one of the things that some skeptics have raised is we don't need AI to be generally intelligent. And it's really, as far as we know, it seems really, really difficult to get there. So no one's going to put in the effort to try and get it there, because a specific AI will do way better than a human will do at a specific task. And so we don't necessarily wouldn't be compelled to create one that can do everything. We don't expect humans to do everything. We don't really need a robot to do everything. We need a lot of little robots who are really good at a thing or a couple of things.
The interface between the general and the specific is sort of where my research interests lie.
Oh, great.
I can talk to you in the broadest terms about large language models, which are to date kind of the only generalists that exist. And there's some vindication, I think, for certain subfields of psychology that are concerned with language, in that what it seems like has happened, and what's part of this unexpected explosion of capability, is that in order to emulate language well, you have to incidentally acquire certain other useful faculties. So Google put out a paper maybe as long as 2 years ago now that was, and I had occasion to discuss this with Steve Hayes. Are friends of the podcast familiar with Steve Hayes?
He actually was a guest on this in the first or second year that we were doing this. So I think so, yeah.
So just a little bit.
Just a little bit, maybe. I had occasion to talk with Steve Hayes, who's a wonderful guy, about a paper Google put out a couple of years ago discussing how the language model they were developing at the time was unexpectedly good at math. Not great, but unexpectedly really good, which was sort of a corollary of his work on language, that we should expect that. And it's also the case that we get decent programming out of these models, right? Like you can ask it to generate Python for you and it will.
Which is a coding language for those that are familiar with that.
The crossover in terminology sometimes kills me.
That's what we're here for. I'll be your everyman. I'll be the person that's like, I have no idea what that means.
Love it. So even the generalist models are like outsourcing some capability to writing code that can then be expressed to give an answer that would be harder to get from within the model itself, because that's a thing you can do when you can produce language. It's not just restricted to English prose. And then there are certain other things that come with that. Like, even though a large language model has never seen a sunset, you might have to develop kind of a model of a world model that includes what a sunset is in order to be able to accurately describe one, right? So what's actually happening when these things are being trained is that they're just guessing the next word that comes in a text. And to get really good at guessing what the next word that comes in a text is going to be, you have to have a model of what the author is saying, what the author's perspective is, the world that the author lives in. So it's not just language. It's not just a model of the syntax. There's maybe buried somewhere deep in the weights, sort of a simulated picture of what things do in the world. So it seems like, for at least for the foreseeable future, our really good general models are going to be language models. But it's also true that we have a lot of specific models, which are kind of what I do with robots and what I've looked at doing for potentially some spaceborne technologies and things like that, where you get a smaller model really, really good at one task. And if you need more sophisticated behavior, you can sort of glue those together. So those are sort of the two directions that people take. Within that, you're right to say that what's the word I want here? The specialists are a lot better at what they do in general than the language models sometimes are.
Okay.
I sent you guys a link to a quiz where you try and guess what GPT is capable of from a set of sample problems. And I think that would be really cool to share with the listeners. But I will summarize my takeaway, large language models are really, really good at giving you realistic answers. What they are trained to do is produce verisimilitude. Sometimes the easiest way to seem correct is just to be correct. And that's a lot of what we rely on in education, right? It's like at a certain point, if we give you enough examples, the best way to fit all of them is going to be to learn the underlying pattern. It'll just take too much. It's too demanding to memorize all the answers.
Right.
Not necessarily always true. I mean, I think probably everybody here has seen some like pretty radical overfitting in a student or inside of a clinic at one time or another, where you see just some pretty phenomenally honed in specific maladaptation.
Sure.
And so in the same way, we don't always get generalization that way, but often in the pursuit of producing realistic language, we do achieve correct language. Neural networks at large are very good at detecting and continuing patterns that might not be obvious in the data. Whatever the data is, the data could be, language, but it could also be like, I've applied some of this to weather forecasting and gotten some really, really good results because
Wow.
there are patterns in weather data that just aren't necessarily salient to a human observer and don't have the emphasis they should have in a conventional statistical model.
Yeah.
They are very good at memorization. I think the count for tunable parameters in GPT-4 is 100 trillion.
Oh, that's all.
It's on that order of magnitude, and that there is a lot of information that you can encode with 100 trillion variables.
Yeah, it seems like it.
There's a lot of combinations there, I would imagine. I think you also just stressed out all of our meteorologist listeners because they were like, I thought I was good at this, and now you're finding out that this software might be, or this tool might be a little bit better than they are at it.
It's possible. I mean, what I've done with this is looked at the upper atmosphere where most of us will never have to worry about it if we're not in space. So for now, meteorologists, you're safe from me.
Well, unfortunately, I need to interrupt with us going into the upper atmosphere where the ads cannot reach us, but unfortunately they stay put in the embedded structure of the episode. Okay, so it seems like we're sort of on a roll here with like what AI is good at versus what it's not good at. So let's keep on that sort of that trajectory here because I think it helps illustrate one of the things I feel like we're building toward and how this is related to psychology and understanding human behavior is the question that everybody has. Is it conscious or can it be conscious? Is it sentient? Can it be sentient? And what do those things mean? So we have to understand right now what it already is doing and what it isn't doing to, I think, arrive at some place where we can have a meaningful discussion about that without having a definitive answer ready at our fingertips.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's get into the what it can for a second here, if you'll indulge me.
I will.
I alluded to the fact that maybe in order to produce realistic, Turing testy language, you have to have kind of a world model. You have to be able to describe something to a human that sounds like it was written by a creature with ears and eyes.
Important features here.
That does not always pan out. When you start asking for spatial reasoning, you start getting really mixed results. There's a kind of problem that I like to play with a lot of large language models where you guys can play along at home if you want. But the example I like to give is like, let's say I'm a clockmaker and I have two clocks, A and B. All right. A is going to be my reference. So A, at some given moment in time, clock A says 8 a.m. and clock B says 8:05, let's say. Okay.
Sounds good.
I'm going to come back in a little bit. Clock A now says 8:04. Clock B now says 8:06. My question is, which clock's hands are turning faster?
I would say, based on just the current outcome, A, but I don't think that we could know because we don't know if the other one is rotating faster based on, like, did it do a full rotation?
I think A is a really good answer, especially if I tell you that you come back on the same day, or if I tell you that you come back, 5 minutes later, or if I tell you that neither clock has done a full rotation, if I add a little bit of information, but like heuristically, it seems likelier that a clock would be, fast or slow by a few minutes than by a whole rotation.
right.
So it's a reasonable answer, right? I wouldn't fault you for saying B if you could say, well, maybe B did a full 360. That's fine. The thing is, when you start asking, I played with Google has a new model called Gemini that gets this consistently wrong every single time if you tell it not to use code. ChatGPT is about 50-50.
Oh,
okay.
Well, I mean, that's about as accurate. It's about as wrong as you can be, really.
Yeah.
When you have two answers.
My experience is that it's very, very sensitive to how the question is phrased, unexpectedly so. So this is like I call this an overhang, right? Where we have a model that can do really sophisticated, incredible stuff, and it's missing the most basic kind of world modeling and reasoning.
Yeah.
That just sounds like me. Like, that just sounds like I can do all this really like interesting stuff, but I don't know how to change a tire or something, like apparently I'm AI is what I've learned in this episode.
It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, I think, right? Because to your point, Shane, it's a little bit like if you didn't know how to change a tire, but you did know how to repair an F-15.
Right. right.
It's weird. It's truly weird because we shouldn't expect to see such poor performance on some measures of basic reasoning when we see such great performance on things like the SAT.
Right.
And it can now pass the bar. I think it passed medical licensing boards. I believe that they did a study where they gave it some symptoms, and they also gave real doctors some symptoms and asked them to try and diagnose, and it actually did better than the doctors did.
Okay, but here we have to be careful too, because that may be true for medicine, because people Google a lot of medical questions.
It's true.
My field is concerned with things that are called things like unscented Kalman filters and discrete Fourier transforms, which are not maybe as present in the internet corpus.
Sure.
So this is another really interesting sensitivity of the model, that when you start asking for very specific information, it will straight up tell you wildly incorrect things. You get what people will call variable salad sometimes. if you get too deep in the weeds, if you get outside of things that people are Googling, like bar exam questions or medical questions, if you get outside of things that aren't like very richly present in the training data, you run into trouble pretty fast with what broadly we call this hallucination. And it's a problem with the other kind of problem I was discussing too. Like, not only will these models give you a wrong answer, they'll give you wrong reasoning. Or like, you can ask with what's called chain of thought. You can say, explain your work before you give me the answer.
Okay.
On some of these problems. And you will get sometimes radically wrong reasoning the whole way through, and then an incorrect answer. Or sometimes, even more strangely, completely correct reasoning that would get you to a valid solution to a question, and then a wrong answer. Or if you don't ask it to put its work first, sometimes you'll get a wrong answer and then correct reasoning that goes off the rails at the very last second and starts like changing the numbers in your original question so that it has a better statistical fit to the answer that it already gave you.
Right. It's a probability machine.
Well, and I guess maybe my question to that would be, because like leading into that, you mentioned that in a place where the training data is rich and like the source is rich and there's a lot of like maybe consistent information in that space, like it makes sense that in a medical model or in a legal model, it could pass a bar or like a medical exam or something like that. But when you get into the more general space, is that an issue? I mean, maybe we don't know this. And this is kind of where my curiosity comes in. Is that an issue where there are too many data inputs that it's just trying to get to a point? Is it an issue of there are too many pathways, or that the data, or there's just not enough?
Any and all of the above. There's been a paper in preprint that I'm going to have to find so that I can send it to you so that you can refer to this maybe. But there's a paper in preprint, last time I checked, demonstrating that you can recover multiple gigabytes at a time of verbatim text from the internet by giving ChatGPT particular prompts.
Okay.
Some of what it's being trained on is recoverable in full form, beginning to end. So that's weird, because that shouldn't happen. we would probably expect, if these models are working the way we expect them to and the way we want them to, that in some way information is being extracted, but we shouldn't be wasting the model size on just like memorizing rote information. And at the same time, we have exactly what you're referring to, which is like a dearth of some subject-specific information. So in some places, it seems like it's too much, where it's being what's called overtrained. In some places, it seems like it's way too little.
Right.
And it's kind of an open question as to how we reconcile that. I think this is really fascinating because it mirrors exactly what you would expect to happen if you sat a baby down with like SAT materials and had it study for 30 years and do nothing else. It feels like it would kind of look like that.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. Like, it'd be incredibly good at answering any and all inquiries related to SAT material, and then would be really bad at basic logic and reasoning.
It's getting better. I do need to add that caveat because people have started to realize that this overhang exists. But yeah. And then this leads us to the last really big problem, which is that I alluded earlier to how there's this issue of like nonlinearity, right? Like language is tricky because the output is not just like the sum of the inputs. The whole is not the sum of the parts.
Yeah, right.
So there are multiple ways to get an AI to do the same thing. A neural network can reach the same output by infinitely many combinations of inputs. So it's hard for that reason to work backwards through what the model is doing and attribute its decisions, attribute its mistakes. That you have to do inductively. There is some work on that because we can kind of peep inside the model and we can see what parts of it are active and what correlates with what. And there's been some really cool work done too on like working backwards to find what combination of inputs makes GPT most likely to say girl, for example.
Sure. Which
it's really sad, actually, what that combination of inputs is. The things that will prompt GPT to say girl are about as colored by the internet as you would expect. But that attribution is really labor intensive, really, really hard to do. For that reason, there is, in the public sector, pretty widespread skepticism of leveraging AI to do any kind of decision making. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, is that all of this is a surprise even to the people doing it.
Right. I remember seeing a story, and please forgive my ignorance on this, but I remember seeing a story where I forget what organization but they created this, it was like an AI robot that like absorbed information and started to learn to kind of communicate better. And it got really racist really quick based on like internet inputs. So I guess it's one of those things where and I've seen that time and time again, where not necessarily that like robots become Nazis, but like that there is this conversation about like how quickly these types of neural networks or these platforms or these like software engines or whatever it might be, they learn so quickly and they adapt so quickly based on the number of inputs that get put in. I don't know if I have a question around that, but I just found that part fascinating. And I guess maybe that's one of like kind of the problems with this stuff and why people don't trust it with decision making, because it gets so easily influenced based on data that it receives.
And Shane, that's like, we don't have a way to deal with that either yet. By the way, the problem of like, yeah, in general, like, being disproportionately affected by certain inputs during training is a problem. But the specific problem of having to deal with just the volume and the intensity of bigotry that exists is why we now have a version of ChatGPT that is so equivocal and accommodating as to be totally non-committal in some of its answers. Right. Because the only way we've figured around that to date is to hit it with the fire hose, the full text corpus of the internet, and then step back and retrain it. Like, okay, now that you have a knowledge base of language, there's a directed effort on retraining, or what's called fine-tuning, to be conciliatory.
Right.
Sure.
I feel like politically correct is such a loaded term anymore. To say that would insinuate maybe that I think this is a wrong approach, or that I think it's an overcorrection. And in the absence of a better way of going about this. I prefer the version of a publicly available natural language supercomputer that you have to try really, really hard to get to be bigoted at you, even if it's maybe not as good of a supercomputer.
Fair.
Right.
It just seems like where we're at right now. I prefer that personally. And maybe that's not everybody, but
I had a whole idea about an episode about that. I'm gonna leave that as the cliffhanger while these ads play, though. I'd had this discussion. There's actually been some actual research on this, as well as a lot of talking points on places where their whole mission is to espouse misinformation or disinformation, but that a lot of these AI things express a liberal bias. And what I interpret that to mean is really hard to force them to be racist. And that's what I think what they mean is like, it will try and say, as you said, it's conciliatory. It's sort of a people pleaser. It's going to try and say as unoffensive a thing as it can possibly say. And that's what they mean by a left-leaning bias. And I'm like, I'm not really sure what else they mean.
I've tried to get GPT to roast my music taste, and it won't do it.
I'll do that for you if you want. I mean, if you want me to, I'm more than happy to. I'm very opinionated about music.
We'll talk. I know Abraham is too, so we're in trouble here.
It's true. Shane and I overlap a lot on music.
I don't know that there's a factual bias. I couldn't speak to that, but I will say that the thing is that and this is sort of off the beaten path, right? Like, irrespective of what decisions you make with what a robot is allowed to say, it will be interpreted as a signifier, right? Like these things are not insulated from the mores of the people building them, nor should they be. It is an inherently political technology because it is a technology of language. And I think language in many ways is inherently political.
Yeah.
Politic, I think, is just discourse on a large scale.
That's beautiful.
As we move into like, thinking about what this does, right? Like for the first time, we have thinking things that are not people that we interact with on a regular basis. And we have to give some consideration to what that does to the composition and cohesion of the societies that we live in, right?
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a more direct consequence. And when I say that, like, I alluded earlier on to my thinking that maybe, the AI apocalypse that people are afraid of is sort of misconceived. I think what I mean by that is I think there's a much greater and more immediate threat in the potential for AI to participate in shaping our preferences and in shaping the language we use with one another and in producing misinformation for us than there is in, like, somebody plugs one into a bomb and blows us up.
Right. The fear of the overtly violent and aggressive apocalypse is not necessarily as easy to get to as, like, let's say, something more pervasive, something more subtle, something more psychological, or something like, more insidious, I guess. Like everybody's expecting Terminator, and they're really looking more at like something almost like a virus that could possibly, like, that's a more realistic concern, I guess.
And I get cagey about alluding to like notions of social cohesion because even that has become, or social contagion, because even that has become sort of loaded. But yeah, I don't have a better way to put that. And especially because what we have given AI some reins over is in serving us information and serving us entertainment. So like we talked about earlier, like TikTok doesn't have, well, maybe they do. I couldn't say this with certainty, but my overwhelming impression is that TikTok does not or does not need to have an ulterior motive in shaping people's preferences and in radicalizing people. All that TikTok needs to do to achieve the end of alienating and radicalizing and compartmentalizing people is to prioritize engagement.
Sure.
Like Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Abraham, earlier on, you said that when we talk about artificial intelligence, what we take artificial to mean is created by humans. I don't think that's a necessary qualifier. I think artificial I think it's sufficient to say that artificial means something other than biological, because in the same way that there are now concerns about stochastic terrorism, right? People motivated to violence by the deluge of content on the internet. I think stochastic intelligence, I think systems with sophisticated behavior that achieve coordination between people that would otherwise be really hard to achieve in the absence of intelligence, that seems to be in the form of like Facebook, for example, something that can kind of maybe just happen. That's a scarier thought to me. Do I still want to keep an eye on, what kinds of automation people are using artificial intelligence for, lest that become like an instrument of violence? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very real risk. But it's not what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is that we have machines that give us and tell us and show us exactly what we ask them to, with a very, very appealing veneer of realism.
I don't get to do this very often. We superimpose in our shows, if we choose to employ a particularly high level vocabulary word or one that we think people might not know, we'll throw in a little music thing that's a transition to a section on vocabulary. And you used a beautiful word, which is stochastic. So could you define stochastic for our audience, please?
I love the jingle. Stochastic is maybe my favorite word. A stochastic process is one that is random in its progression, but random in many different parts. So I could talk to you about the stochastic movement of the particles in a gas, right? Or I could talk to you about the stochastic behavior of people using mass transit in New York on any given day. And so when we talk about stochastic things inside of engineering, we sort of discard the individual data points and we speak about the behavior of the ensemble and the net effects of that ensemble, right? So when we allude to stochastic terrorism, what we mean is there's no single element that we can readily attribute accountability to for the action of a lone wolf terrorist who's been radicalized by the internet or by a hate group. It's been the aggregate of the activity of many different people with many disparate interests who are not necessarily coordinating with one another.
Sure.
In the same way, AI is stochastic in its development in that it develops emergent behavior based on lots of tiny little individual data points that are not necessarily correlated with one another, but that have a pattern in the ensemble. And potentially also we get stochastic behavior from large-scale dynamical systems like human interactions and technological interactions between automated systems. And I think there is a sense in which you could describe the fundaments of psychology, even. You could describe neurology as an essentially stochastic process. I mean, the firing of a neuron, although it has, in the long term, deterministic behavior, is somewhat random. It is orderly in that it is a function of, your neurochemistry, but it is also unpredictable in certain ways.
Lovely.
What a great word.
Yeah, it was a very well explained teaching moment for that word. I appreciate that.
I adore that word. I think it is the single most beautiful thing to have come out of my education these past years.
Wow.
Understanding stochasticity is such a powerful tool for, at least for me, it was a very powerful tool for breaking out of the lens of everything that befalls you being a matter of intention.
Okay.
Sure. I like that.
Yeah. It's a path forward. In the interest of time, I think
yeah.
This is really fun. I'm really enjoying this, but I'd like to get to a discussion on the big worry, and I think one very directly related to generally psychology and maybe more specifically human behavior science, is whether AI can become sentient or conscious. And we've done an episode of consciousness, and I believe we even replayed that as a nostalgia. We do what we call nostalgic episodes for episodes that are 5 or more years older. And we replay them in their entirety and then add a little new information to it. And I think we did that recently with consciousness. And we've also, we haven't replayed these yet, but we did a 3-part series on intelligence years ago. And so I think we've done a little bit of legwork there, but let's talk about whether or not these machines are conscious or could be conscious and or sentient, and how people fear that.
In the pre-roll, you mentioned to me the Google scientist who recently espoused his opinion that Google's BARD model is sentient on the basis of a conversation that he had.
Right.
I will submit that I think the claims of a language model are insufficient as evidence for anything in and of themselves, because, like I said to you at that time, you could very easily prompt BARD to give you an equally compelling argument that it is a squirrel.
Right.
So, like, I hope we can agree that to begin with, that's not going to be satisfactory to us.
I would agree with that.
We would
personally.
be maybe kind of poor behaviorists if it were.
Fair.
You know, I don't think I have a sufficiently clear picture of consciousness, even with the benefit of having talked to you about this before, Abraham. I don't think I have a sufficiently clear picture of what people mean when they say that to answer the question of whether a thing is conscious. And if I wanted to be really radical about it, I mean, I could take umbrage with the notion of consciousness as something that distinguishes humans from non-humans at all. Like, is this a quality that actually exists, or is this a name that we give to a particular set of emergent behaviors? I will say that certain things that we almost unanimously consider relevant to consciousness, such as a continuity of experience, are not features of an AI model in general. ChatGPT does not and cannot perceive anything that is outside of the current text that you're sharing with it. And it does not change in any way, right? Like much like human neurology, the way that these models learn is that they change structurally, except that change is bounded. There is, in general, a period of training, and then the model is what we call frozen. So it is as though I take a picture of all of your synapses, the potentiation of every neuron in your body, and I say, none of that is allowed to change anymore.
Does that mean I don't get older?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, it would mean that you have no knowledge of events outside of what you learned prior to that point and what is immediately available to you. I think continuity of experience tends to be pretty important. We are not all talking to the same ChatGPT when we do. We are talking to many different instances of ChatGPT as it was on a particular date. I do not, however, rule out the possibility that there will one day be. I think it is very philosophically and technically feasible for there to exist a neural network that exhibits sufficiently many behaviors that are subjectively relevant to a definition of consciousness to satisfy anyone. And at that time, we'll have to have the discussion about. There will no longer be any putting it off, as I often do. We'll have to have the discussion about whether there is such a thing as consciousness and what it is, and whether it is meaningfully distinct between how we exhibit it and how machines exhibit it. But for the time being, that's why I'm really attached to this pet idea I have that psychologists, behaviorists are the people most needed in the examination of what AI can do and what it is. For my part, and for many of my colleagues, what we look at is implementation, and what we look at is provable behavior. We look at the specification of the bounds of a model, and we don't do very much with studying empirically after the paper is done. There's an opportunity there. There is an opportunity to study what kinds of emergent capabilities we can get out of a machine. And maybe even that elucidates the boundaries around consciousness. Maybe within that we discover something that seems hard to replicate, seems impossible to replicate, and that we can point to with some justification and say is a definition of sentience.
I think you said very beautifully what I've heard people say that I think identify the problem with consciousness and how and to the extent to which it may be applied to something like AI, which is, what do people mean when they say conscious, regardless of what they're talking about?
Right.
The thing that we've talked about in those episodes is nobody's agreed on that yet. And I'm sort of like, it's sort of like free will. I'm like, well, it depends on how you define it. You want to define it in a way that it encompasses all these things, then sure, we've got free will. If you want to define it in a way that doesn't encompass those things, then no, I think we all agree we don't have free will. And consciousness is the same thing. And I think you also said something really important is this something that is unique and important to humans? Is this a feature of life? Is it a feature of a brain? Is it actually a thing? What do people mean when they say it, and would it apply to something like robots? But then the important thing there is, could it emulate behavior similar enough to what we do in such a way that we would then say that looks like consciousness? And I think as you said, like, absolutely, it could. I think that even with what exists, if you give it a sufficiently correct, well, it would need the opportunity to, I think, generate without a prompt. But if it could do that, I believe you could program it carefully enough that with a very specific instance, you could get something that looks indistinguishable from human behavior for a fleeting moment. And it probably will get more sophisticated to the point where the distinction will become increasingly vague. But I also don't know that matters a lot for the AI apocalypse or concern over much. I don't think that computers would care about humans if they became so self-aware that they were concerned about their own existence. We don't really pose much of a threat to them, and we aren't hogging the resources that they need.
Well, until the Butlerian Jihad, and then we have to worry about all of that, and then have to get guild navigators to get us through fold space to Arrakis for the spice.
I didn't expect the Dune reference when I woke up today.
I am full of multitudes, my friend, full of multitudes.
It's a question of how well specified our relationship to artificial intelligence is and how well specified the goals of a given model are. The goalposts, I will say, move all the time. The Turing test was proposed going on 100 years ago now.
Yeah.
And we have now reached the point where machines can generate language that is, in context, indistinguishable from human speech. I mentioned earlier that sometimes the simplest, easiest way to seem correct is to be correct. The simplest way to seem like you understand something is to understand something. And I don't know what it means when we get to a point where a machine does, even for a fleeting moment, produce something indistinguishable from human behavior. Because what if the simplest way to have the overt similarity is to have a similarity in certain covert properties of that system? For that matter, that's the only reason I have to believe that we all share in something called consciousness, is that you behave similarly enough to me that I can recognize in your actions motivations for similar actions that I would take. I can understand why you would do what you do and why you would say what you say. It seems similar to me, and I know that I have a continuity of experience, and I know that I have a perspective and an awareness of myself and what distinguishes it from my surroundings. That recognition is the only evidence that I have that we are in any way similar. And I don't have a compelling reason to deny that recognition to something that is not a human being. I don't have any compelling reason to deny it to another great ape or to an octopus or to a computer.
Fair.
I like it.
Well, this has been so much fun, and I feel like we should do this again sometime and continue having this discussion about sort of how a consciousness and sentience applies to computers. I think we didn't even really get to some of the specific pitfalls and benefits that the AI may have. I
splattered a whole long outline all over the page, so we got
most of it.
You know what? I will gladly return anytime you'll have me. I'll gladly come and stand on my soapbox, and I would love to listen to more of your thoughts.
Well, great. This has been so much fun. I do like to. I've pontificated about in the past about the relative standing of part of what creates the human experience that I think is worthy of further discussion and in line with all the things that you've talked about that Shane's brought up as well, and how we even think about what it would mean for something to be conscious when it doesn't even have a central point in space, which is something that is uniquely situated to all other biological organisms and even non-biological organisms, as they are situated at a point in space. And AI is not really bound by that in a similar way. It is in the sense that it's on the same planet, but that could change in not that long. So that I think would be something worth talking about. Anyway, As we wrap this up, we like to give some recommendations. They are often unrelated to our topic, but they can certainly be related to our topic. And so what I'll do is I'll do a quick read through our credits here. And then if you have something you would like to recommend, if you'd like to take a second to think about it, I'll be able to just go through these, the necessary information that everybody must know, which includes the fact that if you would like to support us, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, you can pick up some merch. You can join us on Patreon. If you do join us on Patreon, you get some extra benefits like ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, etc. And you also get our adoration and love of you for so long, as long as you keep being a generous, kind person who joins us. And honestly, we appreciate all the people who have ever joined us there. The current list of people includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, of course, to our guest, Joseph Dailey, for joining us on this episode today. And then if you would like to reach out to us and talk to us about your thoughts about AI, we certainly would enjoy hearing from you. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media platforms. As I said, like and subscribe, tell a friend, do all the fun stuff. Is there anything that I'm missing, Shane, or that you'd like to add? Oh, well, hold on. Before I do that, I do need to thank some more people because I've got a team of people who help makes this podcast happen. One of them is Shane.
Hey.
So writing and fact checking from Shane and myself. Thanks for recording with me today, Shane. Music and editing and production from Justin, and then our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Now, Shane, is there anything that I missed or that you'd like to add before we get to our recommendations?
I think I'd just like to put a pin in talking about Asimov's laws of robotics at some point in time.
Yeah, we missed that.
I think that's for part two. I want to make sure that we hit on that part.
Yeah, if a robot cuts down a tree, that seems harmless enough in and of itself, but if it falls across a freeway, does it know that that's a problem? Let's talk about our recommendations then.
Recommendations.
I'll go first because mine is kind of I usually recommend a movie or a TV show or a book or more often than not a game. But today I'm going to recommend that people go on a hike, find a nice park or a nice mountain to climb or something, and just go out in nature, experience the cold, wonderful world around you if you're in the northern hemisphere, or the beautiful, balmy summer that is at its zenith if you're in the southern hemisphere. But just get on the nature. That's my recommendation.
There's definitely a difference between asking somebody to go on a hike versus telling somebody to take a hike, which I feel like is a really unique language thing, to be like, go on a hike versus take a hike. Like it's kind of mean to tell somebody to go do extra work if they don't want to.
Let's appropriate that in order to make it mean nice things again.
Well, I always like those insults that are like old insults, like get lost, which is just inherently mean. It's just tell somebody to go somewhere where they don't know where they are and nobody else knows where they are. Like that in itself is just kind of mean.
Cruel.
Anyway, we're going to take it back. So my recommendation this week is scheduling time to write. So a few years ago, I'd read a book by Questlove. It was called A Creative Quest, and it talked about different ways to stay creative. And one of the things he just said was, do it even if it doesn't make sense or you're not motivated, just so you can kind of continue to grease the wheels a little bit. This year for 2024, I'm going to take some more time to schedule time to write because right now it looks like I've got 6 kind of book projects in the works and about 7 articles that I'm in the process of writing. So based on necessity, I've got to schedule time to write. But I really enjoy writing, and I think if you like that type of thing, schedule some time to do it every day, and it'll be nice and easy.
There's a book by Paul Sylvia called How to Write a Lot, and that is essentially his thesis as well. So, yeah, it's a very funny book also. Joey, do you have a recommendation you'd like to share with folks?
I guess in the spirit of our, enjoy life, self-improvement, New Year's Eve recommendations, I would like to encourage everybody to take a second and listen to your body and take a good stretch, because I have done far too little of that as I've been glued to my chair trying to write a thesis this past year, and it's a really wonderful thing. And so just take a second, be kind to yourself, whatever that means to you. I promise it's worth it.
Wonderful.
I love that.
All right, well, this has been a really fun conversation. As we said, we must return at some point. We have so much more to talk about, but I think that'll do it for today. Thank you again for joining us. Anything you'd like to add before we head out of here, Shane?
Not on my end.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Joey.
Anytime.
All right, this is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.